Thank you very much for coming. I'm here on behalf of Father Piotr, who has an important meeting in Rome and is landing in Rome at this time, probably at this moment. So he asked me to cover for him, my privilege. So thank you very much for coming. And my name is Bourgel. I'm also a teacher here, also an SVP priest, like Father Piotr from the same congregation. And teaching here different subjects, the Bible or Latin language, Polish language, and so on. We would like to welcome very cordially Professor Bourgel, Yonatan Bourgel, Yonatan, depends on the language, how to pronounce this one. Professor Bourgel, his specialty is the ancient Judaism and Christianity, so basically all ancient Jewish Christians. I think your doctoral thesis was about Jewish Christians, the first century and the second century, basically, and defended at the Tel-Aviv University. And then there were Professor Bourgel is professor at the University Laval. That's the university in Canada, as far as I know, the oldest university in Canada. Very, very famous and super big as well. They have more students than辅仁. There's more than 35,000 or something. Yes, it's really a huge university. Professor Bourgel is author of many publications, among them two books in French, one about Jewish Christians and one about King Herod, and published by the Edition itself, a very big publishing house in France. Today the topic will be exploring the question of ancient Jewish Christianity. There's even Chinese translation that you see. Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Bourgel, and welcome very cordially. I don't know, maybe. Okay, so let's begin. Let's not use more time for the introductory things. We are all expecting fascinating topic about ancient Christians.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Very glad to be here. And today we'll be talking about ancient Jewish Christianity. That's the topic. But to begin with, I would like you to look at those images. Okay, there were pictures about 10 years ago. Okay. Okay. Can anyone explain what we see on those pictures? Among those pictures?
I know how to say it in Italian, but I don't know how it's called in English.
Western Wall. Okay.
Yeah.
The Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. What's so special in this place?
Place where people go and pray and have their desires
was a very interesting thing. This site is called the Western Wall, in Hebrew, or in English we say the Wailing Wall, and it is the holiest Jewish site. This is actually the remaining wall of what was 2,000 years ago, the retaining wall of the platform where stood the temple, the second Jewish temple. So what do we see here? I get that you recognize this man. It's Pope Franciscus. Pope Franciscus makes his way to the Western Wall, places his hands on the stones, and slips a note to God. And actually, by doing that, he's following the Jewish custom. Okay? You see that he's accompanied by a Jewish rabbi, which is a rabbi of the Western Wall. So again, you see that the Pope here is actually following the Jewish custom. But actually, what we witness here is the meeting between the representatives of two distinct religions. True enough, the Pope is following a Jewish custom, but there is no confusion. It's clear for everyone that we're witnessing here a meeting between the representatives of two distinct religions. But what we see here, what we are witnessing here, is the result of 2,000 years of relationships between Jews and Christians. And what we'll see today that when Christianity first appeared, I get that you all aware that Christianity appeared as a Jewish movement. Jesus was a Jew. He was raised as a Jew. His first disciples were Jews. And we'll see that the boundary during the first centuries of the Common Era, the boundaries between Christianity and Judaism were not clearly drawn, were present. And to illustrate that, we'll talk about this phenomenon known as Jewish Christianity. Roughly speaking, it refers to people who, on the one hand, maintain a deep connection to Judaism, to their Jewish identity, to the observance of the Jewish law, but on the other hand, confess, believe in Jesus. Okay? But we'll see that defining Jewish Christianity is very challenging. Okay? So, that's will be the outline of my talk. First, we'll talk about the difficulty in defining Jewish Christianity. We'll talk about the scholarly debate that's going on about Jewish Christianity. And then we'll explore a very specific example, a very specific case, the Mother Church of Jerusalem. That is the first church that is established in Jerusalem after Jesus has resurrected. Why? Because it is considered to be the original manifestation of Jewish Christianity. Is everything clear? Yes? Okay. So let's start with our first point. Defining Jewish Christianity. And at the outset, we have to say that the concept of Jewish Christianity is a recent one, is a new one. We do not find the word Jewish Christianity in ancient sources. Obviously, this concept has been first coined in the 17th century, but it is common to ascribe to this theologian, the non-Christian world, the beginning of the scholarly debate about Jewish Christianity. And let's have a look at Bohr's presentation of Jewish Christianity. Bohr has developed a dialectical view of early Christianity. According to Bohr, early Christianity was divided into two competing movements. That of the Apostle Peter, that he called Jewish Christianity, and that of Paul, that he called Gentile Christianity. And so what characterizes each of these currents? Jewish Christianity is a legalistic and particularistic current. What does it mean? First, let's start with by particularistic. Particularistic mean that this current focuses on the spreading of Christianity among Jews. Okay? Now, legalistic. In order to understand this meaning, we have to touch on main Jewish beliefs. Okay, we'll deal with three main beliefs in Judaism. As you know, Judaism is a monotheistic faith, meaning that the Jews believe in the existence of one God, who is the creator of all things, who is all-knowing, almighty. And according to Judaism, God has established a covenant with the people of Israel, that is to say, the Jewish people. Now, like any covenant, this agreement is based on a system of mutual obligations. So God promises to bestow his blessings, his protection, if the Jews adhere to some obligations. The obligation the Jews have to adhere to if they wish to remain worthy of this covenant are recorded in the Torah. What is the Torah? May one of you explain us in a few words what the Torah is? Exactly. The Torah is the holiest part of the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, according to Judaism, the Torah was given to Moses, the greatest of the prophets, during a revelation on Mount Sinai. Okay, now if you look into the Torah, you'll see that it contains story. It starts with the creation of the world, but it contains also commandments, which we call in Hebrew mitzvot. Okay, mitzvot. And those are the obligation that the Jews have to adhere to in order to remain worthy of the covenant. Now, if we return to Bourgel's reconstruction of early Christianity, according to Bourgel, Peter believed that the Torah was still essential for maintaining the covenant with God, meaning that believers in Jesus had to uphold the commandment recorded in the Torah. In contradistinction, Paul believed that the Torah, while being very important, while being holy, was not the means by which a person is justified before God. Paul put the emphasis on the belief in Jesus. This is the belief in Jesus that is the path to salvation. So this is the reconstruction of Paul. On the one hand, it has been criticized as being an oversimplification, but on the other hand, Paul's words have paved the way for the scholarship on Jewish Christianity. And it's very surprising that nearly 200 years after the publication of Paul's words, the concept of Jewish Christianity is still controversial. Not only is the history of this phenomenon, its extent, but also the very definition of Jewish Christianity is still hotly debated, and this is what was. Okay. Many scholars have tried to define Jewish Christianity by identifying what would be the core elements, the core aspects of this phenomenon. So the first criterion that is proposed is the criterion of ethnicity. What does it mean? According to this definition, a Jewish Christian is someone who is born Jewish and who believes in Jesus. It sounds very logical, but it is very problematic. Why is it problematic? Because at least during the first and the second generations of Jesus' disciples, nearly all the disciples were Jews. So using this definition for the first generations is meaningless. If we accept this definition, we would have, for instance, to accept or to consider that Paul himself was a Jewish Christian. Paul is a born Jew. You see that it's not enough. The second criterion is the praxis criterion. What does it mean? It means that according to this definition, a Jewish Christian is a person who, on the one hand, believes in Jesus, but on the other hand, follows the Torah, the commandment of the Torah. It raises other challenges. First, it raises the question of what level of observance is necessary to be called a Jewish Christian. Is it enough to keep Shabbat? Or do you have to keep Shabbat and to eat kosher? That's a question. The second question is whether any Christian who strictly follows the law, regardless of his ethnic background, is to be called a Jewish Christian. Let's take the example of a Gentile who converts to Christianity and decides to follow the Torah. Is he to be called a Jewish Christian? So, you see that its definition as well is problematic. Other scholars have tried to define Christianity, Jewish Christianity, in terms of doctrinal consistency. But we'll see that it's problematic as well. According to those scholars, certain theological concepts may be strictly described to, and specifically ascribed to the Jewish Christians. But we'll see that this definition as well is problematic, and in order to understand that, we'll turn to the patristic literature. The patristic literature, that is the literature of the Church Fathers, the first Christian theologians, we find in this literature description of groups who on the one hand were composed of Jews, people who were born Jews, and who strictly followed the law, but on the other hand, professed the belief, the faith in Jesus. So those groups, those three groups, have been defined as Jewish Christians. Now, if we look into the beliefs of this group, we'll see that they held different theological views. For instance, the Yonatanians probably appeared in the late 1st, early 7th century. They believed in the virgin birth of Jesus and affirmed his divinity. So according to these people, Jesus was born to Mary the Virgin, and Jesus was God. Now, if we turn to this second group, the Ebionites, who are also recognized as Jewish Christians, they rejected both the virgin birth and the divinity of Jesus. According to the Ebionites, Jesus was a man who, because he strictly followed the law, had been adopted by God. And then he becomes the Messiah. So you see that those two groups held very different theological views. And finally, the Al-Qasaites, who appeared in Mesopotamia in the early 2nd century. According to them, Christ appeared several times and transmigrated from one body to another until his ultimate incarnation as Jesus. So you see that here we have very different theological views. And given this, it's very hard to define Jewish Christianity in terms of doctrinal consistency. Okay? So far we've seen that all the definitions that have been proposed are problematic. And yet, how are we to define Jewish Christianity? Some scholars have tried to combine the criteria we've seen so far. We brought this definition that was proposed by a scholar named Patricia Crone, and you will see that she has tried to combine all the criteria we have seen. Jewish Christianity is a modern term for the belief of those followers of Jesus who sought devotion to Jesus as part of God's covenant with Israel, not as a transfer of God's promise of salvation from the Jews to the Gentiles. Some of them regarded Jesus as a prophet, others saw him as a heavenly power. See, here we have a reflection of the different theological views, but all retain their Jewish identity. Here we have the ethnic criterion and continue to observe the Torah. That seems to solve all problems, but the question is, given the differences between the groups we have mentioned, can we still maintain that Christianity was a self-contained entity, that it was a unified movement? More and more scholars are aware of those difficulties, so more and more scholars lately have been calling for more cautious, more careful use of the term Jewish Christianity. And I just want to cite an extreme case. Okay. Lately, a very famous scholar named Daniel Boyarin has called for a dismantling of the category of Jewish Christianity. According to Daniel Boyarin, the use of Jewish Christianity of this category is misleading. It is inadequate. We have to invent new tools in order to address the question of early Christianity. Okay? So you see how complex is the issue of Jewish Christianity. And yet, in the following part of the talk, we'll try, by studying the case of a very specific church, the Church of Jerusalem, we'll try to understand what Jewish Christianity is all about. Of course, we'll see that it's still problematic, but at least we'll have a more concrete case. Okay. Why studying the case of the Mother Church of Jerusalem? First, as I said, because it is considered to be the original, the first manifestation of Jewish Christianity, and also because it is the best documented community. But before we dive into the history of this community, we have to set some historical markers. There's something that I should have. Okay. So, when Jesus appeared, his homeland, Judea, had been occupied by the Romans for nearly 100 years. In the year 63 BCE, General Pompey took control of Judea, and it is a very important point. He put an end to the regime of the Hasmoneans. Why is it so important? Because the regime of the Hasmonean was an independent Jewish regime. Okay? So the Romans come, they take control of Judea, and they put an end to this regime. For many Jews, this is unbearable. Many Jews refuse to accept the loss of their independence. Many Jews believe that by using the force and with the help of God, they'll be able to defeat the Romans and achieve again their independence. That's one point. The second point is that for the Romans had many difficulties understanding the complexity of Judaism, the specifics of Judaism. In many cases, they act either clumsily or maliciously. So those two aspects will shape the relationships between Jews and Romans during the next 2 centuries. Okay, we have to keep in mind that this period is a very tense period. Initially, the Romans decide to indirectly rule Judea by appointing what is called client kings. Client kings are local kings, okay, who on the one hand are aware of the customs, in our case of the Jews, but on the other hand, rule territories for the sake of Rome. The most famous of those kings is Herod. Have you heard of Herod? Herod the Great? Yes? What's context?
The context of the story of Jesus.
Of course. Yes. So Herod is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. He's known for his cruelty. But actually, we have to say that Herod the Great was a very shrewd and very smart ruler, and he managed to stabilize the situation in Judea. He's also known as being a great builder. And we see that he's the one who has hence beautified the temple in Jerusalem. But the problem is that at some point Herod died. And again, the Romans were confronted with a situation of unrest. And then they decided to change the form of governance of Judea. So at this point, they shift to direct rule. What does it mean in fact? That they established their administration, their officials to rule Judea. But remember, most of the Romans, Jewish custom, are very complex, weird, and they had difficulty to understand them. And so this changed. The purpose of this change was to stabilize, pacify Judea, and actually it had the opposite effect. And the situation will keep deteriorating until great troubles broke out in the year 66. Okay, so 6 decades after the creation of the province of Judea, a great major revolt breaks out. At the end of which the temple is destroyed. This is a major event in the history of Judaism. The destruction of the temple, of the second temple, marks the forming of a new form of Judaism. This is a modern Judaism, what is called rabbinic Judaism, without sacrifices. We had the opportunity to talk a little more about the temple. What may be surprising that 6 decades after this major defeat, a second revolt breaks out. It's called the Bourgel revolt. Okay, so we see that the situation of this period is a very complex one, very tense one. And this is when appears the Mother Church of Jerusalem. Okay, so we'll try to trace the history of this church from his foundation after the resurrection of Jesus until his disappearance as a Jewish church, following the destruction, the repression of the Bourgel revolt. We'll see what we managed to cover with the time we had, but we'll do our best. Okay, another point regarding the religious context. Okay, so I'll introduce you to this man, very important man, Flavius Josephus, very important Jewish historian. Is our main source about the Second Temple period. And Josephus, in his writings, depicts the main pillars of the Judaism of the time of Jesus. And what does it tell us? That at the time, Judaism was divided into groups. It was not a monolithic religion, it was divided into different groups. Of course, they shared commonalities, but they had also big differences. Okay, and we have to realize, we have to understand that when it appeared, Jesus' movement was just one of those groups. Okay, this we have to keep in mind. When we deal with the Mother Church of Jerusalem, we have to understand that it's just one of those groups that then composed Judaism. Okay? So, now we'll dive into the history of this church. And our main source, at least for the first 30 years, is the Acts of the Apostles. That is the 5th book of the New Testament. That covers a period of about 30 years, from the mid-30s to the mid-60s. It spans from the resurrection of Jesus until the imprisonment of Paul in Rome. Okay, and actually it focuses on 2 major characters, 2 major figures. Peter, the leader of the Jerusalem church, and Paul. Okay, so a few words about the composition of this work. It is universally accepted that this work is actually the continuation of the third gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Okay, it is widely accepted. Both works share common language, common style. They are both dedicated to the same person, to Phineas. And actually, the author of Acts refers to the first work he has written about Jesus. From the 2nd century onward, the Christian tradition ascribed the authorship of this book to Luke. Who was Luke? He was a companion of Paul, a physician, a Gentile. So that's what the Christian tradition said. Actually, we do know who was the author of both books. Usually, it is agreed that the Acts of the Apostles, as well as the Gospel of Luke, had been written in the late 1st century, that is, after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay? Now, what are the key theological themes in the book of Acts? There are many, but we'll refer to two. The first, of course, deals with the universality of the Christian mission. Luke stresses that the gospel is for everyone. It is intended for everyone, Jews and non-Jews alike. So it is very important for Luke to portray the inclusion of the Gentiles as a divine command, as a divine mandate. And we see that the question of the mission to the Gentiles is a focal point of the book of Acts. And it's clear from the outset of this book. The book of Acts begins with Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, who remains during 40 days with his disciples and gives them instructions. Look at the instructions he gives them. That you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea. So we see Judea as a surrounding region of Jerusalem, inhabited by Jews. And Samaria, and this is not by accident, it is not coincidental that the mission has to go to Samaria before it goes to the end of the earth, that is to the Gentiles. We see that Samaria is a bridge between the Jewish world and the world of the Gentiles. So we see that the progression, according to the book of Acts, the progression of the mission has to follow a very strict plan, a very well elaborated plan, and of course we'll deal with this question of the inclusion of the Gentiles. If there is no inclusion of the Gentiles, there is no Jewish Christianity, because Christianity remains a full Jewish movement. We don't have to specify that it is Jew. So the question of the inclusion of the Gentiles is a very important topic. The second point I would like to stress Luke seeks to portray an idealized picture of the early church, the Christian mission, and its progression. What does it mean? It means that Luke wants to picture the early church in a very harmonious way. He wants to show that there is a consensus, a wide consensus, and when conflict emerges, it is very quickly resolved and definitively resolved. Why so? Because according to Luke, the mission to the Gentile happens under God's guidance. It is not a human enterprise, it is a God enterprise. So it's very important for Luke to show that there are no obstacles. And if there are obstacles, they are very quickly removed. And we see that it's very important to keep that in mind when we go through the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Okay? So now it's time to dive into the book of Acts. Of course, we don't have time. Okay. Is the book of Acts a reliable historical source of Christianity? This is a very important question. And we have to remember that the Book of Acts is a theological work, it is not a historical work. The intention of the author of this book is to convince the reader of the truth of the gospel and of its divine origins, and yet it has been shown by many scholars that the historical detail that Luke provides are accurate and that they can be supported by other sources like Josephus. So we here have quoted what Charles Albert wrote about it, and of corroborating data has been assembled already by scholars to enable one to conclude that the Book of Acts is not mere fiction, and that its record is reasonably reliable in areas where it can be checked. Okay? So, of course, we should be cautious, we should be careful, but we cannot dismiss this book as being not historical. Okay? Good. Okay. So let's dive into the Book of Acts again. We don't have time to deal and to address every detail. We'll just try to focus on key questions. So as we've seen, the Book of Acts begins with Jesus reminding his disciples during 40 days, and then goes up to the sky, and the disciples are commonly required to go back to Jerusalem. What they do from the Mount of Olives, and just a word about another question that has been addressed by scholars and historians, theologians, archaeologists, according to the Christian traditions. They went back to what's called the upper room, the cenacle. Of course, what you see here are images of a 14th century building. So, of course, it's not a place where Jesus and his disciples where they gathered after Jesus ascended to the sky. But some scholars believe that next to this place, they have found the remains of first century Jewish Christian synagogues, but it's very dubious. Actually, this is not certain at all because there is a problem of datation. So we'll leave it here. According to the Book of Acts, and I don't want to dwell on that, the founding event of the church is when the disciples gather together and the Holy Spirit descends upon them. Why is it so important? Because the Holy Spirit enabled them to speak different tongues, to speak different languages, and this is exactly what empowers them to spread the gospel, not only among Jews who speak either Hebrew or Aramaic, but to the nations. So we see that it is not by accident that this is the founding event of the church. But what is more relevant to us is the question of the composition and organization of this church. So first, the leadership. According to the Book of Acts 12, the 12 apostles that Jesus had appointed, with the exception of Judah, of course, are the leaders of the church, with Peter having a special position. Okay? But what I would like us to do now is to read into two passages in the Book of Acts just to get a sense of what is the way of life of this community. So it's the second and the third text in your handout. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts, and brought bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And the second text, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own, They shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerful at work in them, all they were not any person among them. For from time to time, those who owned land and houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Okay. What do we learn from that? First, the member of the church lived a communal life. Okay, that's the first one. They lived together. They constituted a community. So here's this. The second point that is outstanding. Sorry. Okay. Community of goods. It's a shared property. Someone who owned a house, a field, had to sell it and to give the proceeds to the community fund. Third point. They shared liturgical meals and prayers. Okay, and before I move forward, just want to stress the fact that their case is not unique in the religious landscape of Judea. And briefly, I want to address the case of the Essenes. You remember we've seen that Judaism at the time of Jesus was divided into different movements. Now, we know of the Essenes thanks to Josephus' writings. So the Essenes are a group of ascetics. Okay, they appeared in the 7th century BCE and disappeared in the late 1st century CE. And this is what Josephus said about it. So if you want to go through it, please do. That they lived in communities, that they shared property, that they shared meals. So, of course, we should be careful not to draw a direct connection between the Essenes and the members of the first Christian community. But it's interesting to see that they shared community, that there were ideas in Judea that were shared by different groups. This idea of sharing property, enriching itself, that's something that should be done. That they pray together. But of course, there were also differences between the Essenes and the first Christians. It seemed that the first Christians were much more open to outsiders and were the Essenes. Another point that is very important is the Temple of Jerusalem. We read that the members of the community visited the Temple of Jerusalem. Here we have to say a word about this special place. So this is where actually the first members of the community are reported to have preached. We have to understand what the Temple of Jerusalem means for the first century Jew. The Temple of Jerusalem is the place that God Himself has chosen to be worshipped. This is the only place where Jews are allowed to perform sacrifices. The temple is the meeting place between the earth and the heaven. This is the dwelling place of God's presence on earth. So you understand that it's not by accident that, at least according to the book of Acts, the disciples go to the temple. And you'll see, it makes it even more interesting that the validity of the temple and the function of the temple will be debated within the church. It will become a controversial topic within the church itself at the beginning. And the preaching, of course. According to the book of Acts, the apostles go to the temple courts, as we have seen, and they convince more and more Jews. And so the community is growing. It consisted at the beginning of 120 members, and it grows to 3,000. members and then to 5,000 members until it begins to worry the authorities, the Jewish authorities of the temple, meaning more specifically the Sadducees who arrest the apostles. But each time the apostles manage to miraculously escape. Again, you see this tendency in the book of Acts that nothing can stop the mission. Okay? And actually we'll see that it is an internal event that will disrupt the life of the first community, but I suggest that we take a break.
Okay, right. Yeah, so let's take a break.
So, as I said, according to Luke, the author of the book of Acts, nothing can stop the progression of the mission until a conflict erupts within the community itself. And actually, we hear of this conflict with no prior indication. We are suddenly told that conflict erupts between two groups. So it's new to us that the community was divided into two groups, the Hebrews and the Hellenists. The Hellenists complain that their widows have been neglected in the daily distribution of aid. Okay, but remember, Luke seeks to show that nothing can stop the progression of the mission. And when there is a conflict, so it is very quickly and definitely settled. And this is exactly what happened. Soon the apostles gathered and they appoint 7 men, 7 deacons, and they entrust them with the service of the widow. So you see, again, there was a conflict, but it was shortly settled. But this very short passage is very interesting. It is interesting because it gives us insight concerning the composition of the church. So first we see that the church was divided into two groups, and of course, the first question that rises is, how are we to identify this group? And scholars do not agree about the identification of these two groups. And here we'll see several proposals regarding what makes up their identity. So for some, those two groups were distinguished by their languages, meaning that the Hebrews spoke either Hebrew or Aramaic, while the Hellenists spoke Greek. And these have implications. Of course it does, because it probably means that soon two forms of worship appear, one in Greek and one in either Aramaic or Hebrew. For others, the Hebrews and the Hellenists came from different geographical origins, meaning that the Hebrew came from Jerusalem, Judea, while the Hellenists came from diaspora. Just a word about this phenomenon called diaspora. Okay, no worries. There were many communities that were settled around the Mediterranean basin. Many Jewish communities, and we know that Jews came from many places to Jerusalem, not only during the pilgrimages, but also to settle. We know that that's a phenomenon that existed. For some scholars, the Hebrews and the Hellenists led different ways of life, meaning that the Hellenists led the Greek way of life. Okay, that's the proposal. And the last proposal that is less likely, that the two groups had different ethnic backgrounds, meaning that while the Hebrews were Jews, the Hellenists were Gentiles, non-Jews. But it is not likely because we know that the head of the Hellenists, Stephen, was a Jew, speaks as a Jew. This is exactly what we see. Anyway, you see that the community is divided and that not after long, the Hellenists experience a shortage and they feel that their widows have been neglected. But it seems actually, and this is what we see, that the division between the two groups is not only a matter of charity. It seems that there were conceptual ideas that were in the center of this division. We see that maybe touched on issues related to the temple or to the inclusion of the Gentiles. This is what we see. And we see as well that although Luke tried to present us a very idealized view of the community, we see that there were inequalities within the community. Okay, the widows of the Hellenists were fully dependent upon the community and they did not receive what they needed. But again, according to Luke, the conflict was settled. Then, straight after the resolution of the conflict, Luke reports another dramatic event that we have to address, the martyrdom of Stephen. Stephen is the head of the Hellenists, performs miracles, and according to what Luke tells us, he's soon accused of blaspheming Moses and God. So he's arrested, he's led to his trial before the Sanhedrin. You know what the Sanhedrin is? It's a Jewish high court that is headed by the high priest. And instead of directly defending himself, Stephen gives a speech, a long speech reviewing the history of Israel. When we get into the details of the speech, it's enough to say that he ends his speech by two critics, addressing two critics. The first one concerns the temple. We've seen how much the temple is important for the Jews. What does Stephen say? No, the temple is a handmade building. This is not the dwelling place of God. That's the first critique, and the second critique that blamed the Jews for throughout their history, from Moses onward to Jesus, for rejecting the messengers of God. And this is what leads actually to his martyrdom, because then the crowd takes him outside of the city and stone him to death. And so Stephen is considered to be the first martyr. Martyrs in Greek means witness, but he's the one who is a witness of Jesus by suffering, through his death. And this is the point that I want to reach. Following the death of Stephen begins a persecution. This persecution leads to the scattering of the members of the church to Judea and to Samaria. Actually, Luke gives us a very interesting detail. He said that the church was scattered, but the apostles, the 12 apostles, remained in Jerusalem. And so for some scholars, this persecution was actually targeting the Hellenists, not the Hebrews. The Hellenists because of their views about the temple. But according to Luke, quite ironically, this persecution thought to destroy Christianity actually contribute to its spread, contribute to its growing. And Luke reports that one of the Hellenists, Philip, goes to Samaria. So you see, Samaria is this region, the north of Judea. And as I said, it is not by accident that Philip, according to the scheme of Luke, Philip goes to Samaria. Why going to Samaria? Who lived there? The Samaritans. Who are the Samaritans? They are a community very close to the Jews. They share many commonalities with the Jews. They believe in the God of Israel. They respect the Torah. They see themselves as Israelites. But from the perspective of the Jews, they're not actually Jews, but they're not Gentiles either. They are actually the bridge between the Jewish world and the world of the Gentiles. So you see that the progression follows a very logical path. Okay? And it is not by accident that right after bringing faith in Jesus to Samaria, Philip goes to the city, the Greek city of the cross. Greek city of the coast. Remember, we've seen that, but Judea was inhabited by a vast Jewish majority and by an important Gentile minority. There were non-Jews living, especially on the seashore, and Philip got there to spread the news. And the Hellenists, this is what we're told, continued and spread the news, that is, the belief in Jesus, till they reached Antioch. The role of the Hellenists is very important. They are to the bridge between Jesus and Paul. They are the first to translate sayings of Jesus, traditions of Jesus into Greek. And they are the first to bring those beliefs to the major urban centers of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Okay? But even before Paul. Okay? So they play a very important role. And again, it could be that we've seen that the division between the Hebrews and the Hellenists was not only a matter of charity distribution of the daily aid. It could well be that it was deeper, that it touched on very important topics such as the function of the temple. We've seen that Stephen was very critical, but also the inclusion of the Gentiles. And yet, it is very important for Luke, the author of the book of Acts, to show that there was a wide consensus about this question of the inclusion of Gentiles. And this is not coincidental, this is not by accident, but right after this event, we report another case of conversion. Yes, the conversion of Cornelius. Who is Cornelius? Cornelius is a Roman centurion stationed in Judea. Remember that Judea was occupied by the Romans, so it is not surprising that there were Roman soldiers in Judea. He lives in Caesarea. Caesarea was the administrative capital of Judea. And Cornelius is said to be a God-fearer. What does it mean? It means that Cornelius believes in God, the God of Israel. And there were other God-fearers. It means people who, on the one hand, were attracted to Judaism, believed in the God of Israel, but on the other hand, were not fully converted. Okay? So Cornelius is a God-fearer, depicted as being a pious man, and he has a vision. He has a vision of an angel telling him that his prayer has been heard. This is one part of the story. The second part concerns Peter, not the Hellenist, Peter, the head of the community. And Peter as well has a vision, but a different kind of vision. A vision where God instructs him, informs him that he has cancelled, and we see why it is so important, cancelled the food, the laws of the Torah. We'll see what is the connection between the two. As you may know, according to the Torah, the Jews are forbidden to eat certain types of food. For example, Jews are not allowed to eat pork, but not only, there are many different types of food that are considered to be impure. So Jews are forbidden to eat this food. According to the vision that Peter received, God cancels us. Why is it so important? Because actually it's what we call kashrut. This is the dietary laws of the Jews. Those laws kept Jews separated from Gentiles. Jews could not eat, could not share their meals with Gentiles. Now, how do you socialize? The best way to socialize is to eat together. But when you are prevented from eating with others, it is problematic if you intend to spread your belief among the Gentiles. So, according to Luke, God instructed Peter that there was no more food laws. And so, actually, this episode is very important in two key respects. First, because it means that the strict boundaries between Jews and Gentiles have been removed. There are no more boundaries. You can go to the pagan, you can socialize with them, you can spread the news among the pagans. And two, because Peter, as the head of the Jerusalem church, is depicted as an advocate of the mission to the Gentiles. Again, you see that there is a wide consensus. At least this is what the author of the book of Acts wants us to have. There is a consensus within the church. There are some people who ask Peter about the meaning of, because eventually this is how the story ends. Peter encountered Cornelius. Cornelius received the Holy Spirit, and Peter baptized him. Okay, so Peter is the first to formally baptize a Gentile. Okay, so again, it's very important for Luke to show that there is a consensus. And not only do the Hellenists spread the news among the Gentiles, Peter himself converted Gentiles. But I don't know if we have time to, but if we do, we'll see that in Paul's epistle, the portrait of Peter does not strictly follow the lines of what we read here in the book of Acts. Okay? And we'll see that actually this issue of the inclusion of the Gentiles remains deeply controversial within the first church. We feel that there is a party within the church who is not ready to include Gentiles unless they become Jews, unless circumcised, unless they strictly stick and follow to the laws of the Torah. And this is what we see in a very important episode. So it's a twofold episode: the incident at Antioch and the Jerusalem Council. And before we do, we have to briefly introduce two major characters. First, James, the brother of Jesus, whom we haven't talked, and briefly we'll talk about Paul of Tarsus, and then we'll address the core issue. James, the brother of Jesus, obviously he was Jesus' biological brother. He's mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, so that Jesus had brothers and sisters. This is something that, from the 7th century onward, brought some embarrassment because it seems to nullify the belief in the virginity of Mary. So we have seen, from the 7th century onwards, attempts to try to explain this, that it was not really Jesus' brother, but it seemed that it was his biological brother. And it seems that very soon he occupied a very prominent place within the church. You see that here in the letter to the Galatians. Paul said that 3 years after he converted, he met up with James. See, I saw no one of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. And it is clear that at some point, Peter will step back from the forefront, and James will become the leader of the Jerusalem church. Now we have to understand that James is a key figure for Jewish Christian groups. The memory of James will be kept within those groups during the first centuries. This is James' word about Paul. Paul has a multifaceted identity. You see that Paul is a Jew from the diaspora. Remember we talked about the community from the diaspora. He comes from the city of Tarsus. So this is one aspect of his identity. He's a Greek speaking, but according to the book of Acts, he speaks Aramaic as well. He is a Roman citizen that plays a role as well in the book of Acts. More interesting to us is the Pharisee. It means that he belongs to this current of the Pharisee. Actually, at the beginning, Paul persecutes the Christians until he witnesses conversion, vision, and then he converts to Christianity and see his mission as spreading the good news, the gospel among the Gentiles. Okay? But let's go back now to what is called. Okay. The incident at Antioch. Antioch is a major city. It is the third largest city in the Roman Empire after Rome and Alexandria. And we've seen that the Hellenists, after the scatter on the left Jerusalem, reached to Antioch. So this is the first major city where Christianity gained a foothold. And it becomes the seat of a major Christian community. Actually, it seems that there were two centers, Jerusalem on the one hand and Antioch on the other. And this is there, according to the book of Acts, that for the first time, you see, the disciples were first called Christians. And it has implications. It means that we were seen as having specific features, as being a distinct group. And this is from Antioch that will begin a systematic and independent mission to the Gentiles. Okay? Those disciples, those Hellenists who are in Antioch, go to the city of Asia Minor and convert Gentiles. And this is then that Paul joins this community. Okay? This is the background. Now we'll see that conflict erupts in this community. This is exactly what we see. We have two sources for that. The 15th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles and the 7th chapter of the Epistles to the Galatians. Okay. So this is the text number 15. The third part of this chapter. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So, some believers came from Judea. Obviously, they wanted to see what's going on at Antioch, and they tell to the Gentile who had joined the church, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. In other words, you have to convert to Judaism to be saved. It is not only a matter of ethnicity, it is also a matter of salvation. There is no other way to be saved. To believe in Jesus is not enough. You have to follow the rules of the law. This brought Paul, Barnabas is a companion of Paul, into sharp dispute and debate with them. See that Paul opposes this command, stand against this demand. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. So they decided to go to Jerusalem to consult with the leaders there. And so they do, go to Jerusalem. They meet with the leaders, Peter, Paul, and James. So Peter, James, Paul gives a report of the successes of the mission to the Gentiles. And then again, we heard of people who opposed the mission to the Gentiles. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. So first, you see, it's very interesting to see that Pharisees joined the church. You see that there was some fluidity between the different groups. And two, contrary to the impression we had that there was a wide consensus regarding the inclusion of Gentiles, it was a party who proposed the cancellation of the Torah observance and the condition for the acceptance of the Gentiles. Those people believe that Gentiles who want to join the church first has to convert to Judaism. There is no other way. And finally, so Peter is said to have given a speech, but finally James is the one who makes the decision. James, the brother of Jesus. Therefore, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from sins polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. So we see that James does not impose the observance of the whole Torah on the Gentiles. But it does impose 4 prohibition. Sins polluted by idols is actually meat that from animals that have been slaughtered during pagan sacrifices. Sexual immorality. This is forbidden to engage in sexual unions outside of the marriage. From whatever has been strangled, maybe we have a specialist in the question here, so maybe you could add some insight on this point. But maybe the meaning is that only animals who have been properly slaughtered, maybe according to the book of Leviticus, are only their meat are to be eaten, and blood. The consumption of blood is forbidden. According to Judaism, this is a law to which all the humanity is subject. No human beings should eat blood because this is the place where the soul of the animal is to be found. But the point that is interesting is that according to what is called the Apostolic Decree, see that Gentiles can join the church without becoming Jews. And according to the book of Acts, this is where the conflict is resolved, where it is settled, consensus has been reached. But the problem is that when we turn to Paul, to the writings of Paul, we have another impression. This is what we see Paul, and I think that by mentioning that, Paul, it is widely accepted that Paul, in his epistle to the Galatians, gives an alternative version of the Council in Jerusalem. And actually, at the beginning, it does follow the line of what we see in the book of Acts. And Paul goes to Jerusalem and said that the leaders actually do not impose circumcision on Gentiles, and actually confirm his ministry to the Gentiles. But the difference between what Paul said and what we find in the book of Acts is that there is another conflict that happens. This is not the end of the conflict, and this is what we read here. But when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned for until certain people came from James. So James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, this is sent people to Antioch to see what's going on there. He used to eat with the Gentiles. So before people from James came to Antioch, Peter agreed to eat with Gentiles, and we see how important it is to socialize. But after the people came from James, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. The circumcision faction. We see again that the church is divided. What the meaning of the circumcision faction? Two steps, middleness. We realize that people believe that Gentiles have to circumcise in order to be saved. That's what we see. And the other Jew joined him in his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compare the Gentiles to me, a Jew? So you see that the conflict is not settled. The church is still divided about this question. Shall we include Gentiles into the church? And if so, what condition shall we put in them? You see that James obviously is very reserved about the way Paul carries the mission to the Gentiles. So, I'm sorry to read the material so that we have more time, but maybe we should stop here.
It's up to you. You can also continue. We can first have question and answers. All right. So maybe at this point, we can have some question and answers. We will see it. If you have any kind of issues you would like to ask, we see what happens. Any kind of questions that you can think of, you will also
Which one is this gene of Joseph? Is it James Minor, the Minor?
James the Minor is identified as James, brother of Jesus. So this is James, the brother of Jesus. And he's the leader of the church in this time. He's the one who decides on how to act. Actually, it's quite interesting that in the epistles we don't hear about the apostolic decree. We don't hear about the rule. According to the book of Acts, James, the brother of Jesus, is the one who decides to impose on the Gentiles for prohibitions. He's the one who leads the community, and you see that what we read here, it seems that a consensus has been reached that James actually is favorable of what Paul is doing, but the fact that James, after the so-called resolution of the conflict, sent people to Antioch to see what's going on here is very suspicious. So maybe again, can we speculate about the reason, the motivation of James? Why he sent people to look after, to check what's going on in Antioch? And why did Peter change his behavior? Obviously, he was scared by James. He knew that James would have opposed. So now, what was again the motivation of James? For some, James just wanted to make sure that Jews would not transgress the law. But if you look at that, at the last sentence, obviously, what was at stake was the inclusion of the Gentiles and how Gentiles could be included into the church. So it's very hard to know what was the doctrinal stance of James. Was he an advocate of the mission to the Gentiles? Or was he very reserved, to say, opposed to the mission to the Gentiles? We have two different portrayals of James when you compare those different sources.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
I would like to know, it's correct to say that also three Jewish people did not help them to define the identity of a Jewish Christian person. How was the role of history and so many diaspora of the Jewish people according to the definition of Jewish
That is the whole point. That, again, we've seen that defining Jewish Christianity is very complicated.
Yeah.
But we know that there were groups of Christian, Jesus believers, kept defining themselves as Jews, meaning as Israel, and saw themselves as connected to the history of Israel. And actually, we know that Jews till today hope and wait for the coming of the Messiah, the Mashiach. So the only difference is between the other Jews and themselves is that from their perspective, the Messiah had come, and they believe in the right Messiah, but they saw themselves as Jew. In our instance, so they saw themselves related to the history of the Jewish people. I'm not sure that I answered your question, but what is the point of the question?
I would like just want to know the role of the history of the Jewish people. Was it important or not? Was it easy or not to define Jewish Christian identity? The relationship between history, the Jewish people, and definition of the Jewish Christian identity.
I think it was because it has to do as well with the history of salvation. The fact that if you open the book of Matthew, you see that there is a genealogy and that Jesus is said to be the descendant of David. So, even for Christians today, the fact that the whole Christians call the Old Testament Hebrew Scripture is part of the Holy Scripture of Christians. Even Christians who are not Jewish Christians relate themselves to the salvation history of Israel. You cannot understand New Testament if you don't hold the Hebrew Scriptures. So, of course, I think that they had to relate themselves to the history of Israel.
Any more questions, please?
It deals with the question of the role of the Torah. According to the Jewish people, the Torah is the only means of salvation. You have to stick to follow the rules of the Torah, and this is exactly what we read in the passage number 5. Unless you are circumcised, meaning unless you follow the rules of the Torah and because content like this, you cannot be saved. So, according to the Jew, the validity of the Torah, the means to salvation, is eternal. Now, according to non-Jewish Christian who are not Jews, the Torah is no more valid as a means of salvation. What the person will be saved only through his faith in Jesus. So that's the big difference. I'm not sure I understand. For all Jews, all the movement we've seen, Pharisees, Essenes, Sadducees, they all have a different interpretation of the law, and this is what at stake when they argue with each other. They all consider that the law was holy. The question that you had a text and you have to interpret it. To apply the law, you have to interpret the law. And so they all defend the different interpretation of the law. And that's what was at stake.
Any more questions? Maybe I ask one about Stephen. You mentioned Stephen, that's when you come across theory. I did not check it myself, okay, so I don't know if it's about its validity. But that Stephen has something to do with the Samaritans. Maybe he was Samaritan himself, because if you examine his speech in the Acts of the Apostles, right before he is stoned, he has a big speech, and he's quoting he's portraying part of the salvation history from the Torah and afterwards as well. Basically, some of these points there, I think they match Samaritan Pentateuch, which has some special features. Now I did not examine. I examined that there is really, if you compare it with the Codex Leningradensis, there are some different portrayals, or different. There are some points, that seem not to match together. So maybe it's taken from some people claim it was from the Samaritan Pentateuch. I did not examine that, but did you come across it?
Of course, but I don't think it's convincing. I mean, there are commonalities between Stephen and the Samaritans. This is a rejection of the Temple of Jerusalem. But Stephen rejected the Temple of Jerusalem because it is a handmade building, while the Samaritans reject the Temple of Jerusalem because it is Jerusalem and not Gerizim. What we talk about the Samaritans, we think that they're very close to the Jews. They believe in God of Israel. They live according to the law. But the main difference between Jews and Samaritans is that while the Jews considers that Jerusalem the place that God has chosen to be worshipped, the Samaritan considers that it is Gerizim. Gerizim is the mount in Samaria. And according to the Samaritans, this is the place that God has chosen to be worshipped, not Jerusalem. So this is the main point of controversy between Jews and Samaritans. And this is not what Stephen said. Stephen rejects the temple in Jerusalem, but because it is a handmade temple. It is not because it is in Jerusalem, but because it is a handmade temple. So therefore, I think that
Yeah, yeah. I don't know myself.
That is interesting. Yeah, interesting.
Right.
And so I'm both French and Israeli, and I'm a Jew. I was very interested that coming to your second question with the issues of religious categories and identity. How one comes to consider himself as different while he used to be the same. Very interested in this question. And then as well as spoke about the Samaritans. I'm very interested in the Samaritan as well. With that, when do the same becomes the others, and what causes it? So, and regarding the third question about the beginning of Christianity, I get that it's Paul and Peter, but yeah, maybe you have a more good answer regarding the beginning of Christianity in Italy.
In Italy.
That was your question, right?
Right.
Sorry?
In Rome.
It doesn't know it started to like right?
What we're told in the book of Acts is that Paul was arrested and he asked to be tried by the emperor because he was a Roman citizen, so he's sent to Rome. But we don't know actually. We don't know that. The book of Acts doesn't say a word about his death. But and we know from I think Scriptures that they were Christians under Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, and Peter as well is said to have been crucified in Rome.
Also the very the letter of Paul to the Romans, that is an undisputed letter written by him, but also Paul wrote it before he was in Rome, before so he wrote it to the Roman community there, that he had some contacts, and from the letter we also learned that even at the house of the emperor there were Christians. So it must have been very early on in the first Christians were right there. And Paul met some guys from Rome, Jewish or non-Jewish Christians, like Priscilla and Aquila, the Acts. Because of the persecution, they had to leave. I think it was Claudius who chased the Jews out of Rome. And among them Christians as well. I don't think the Romans did not stay with them at this point. So it must have been very early on, but I'm not sure if we have any kind of historic evidence like who was the first Christian in Rome, actually who came there. We know that there were for sure. There was Peter afterwards. There was Paul as well, and we have also who actually came as the first one who transmitted the faith. I don't know. I must say. That's so. I don't know what to do because I think the time is upon us somehow because it's. Again, I did not hear the bell. There's a peculiar thing of this classroom that you don't hear and all that. So maybe, thank you, Professor Bourgel, for this lecture. I think it gave us a lot of understanding in different issues, and also it was really very interesting. And thank you for attending this class. There will be another opportunity as well. I don't know if you have time, but it's 9th of April. I think, that's another lecture. 9th of April, I think it's also more or less the same time. So Wednesday, early afternoon, and it will be about Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. Yes, it was a very fascinating topic also, because it's it's good to know. Jerusalem, the best way to know is to go there and to live there for some time, actually, but it's not everybody has this opportunity, so it's good to have at least the knowledge from the others, because it's also one can understand also better the New Testament, also when you read the Gospels, when you read the historical places, basically. So thank you again, and we can maybe stop like this to look at my time more. So let's back to the